Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, ambassadors serving and past. I have three apologies to make as I commence. The first of them is I'm going to speak in somewhat rapid staccato because I was under the impression that I had 15 minutes per section, whereas I don't. And my second apology is specifically to Jenny Grant, who told me that everything else being all right, just be brief. I have no idea whether I'm going to be able to manage that. And my third, of course, is to Ambassador Bhagirath, who has indicated that the IONS IORA symbiosis has been a difficult one, and this is going to be therefore a persistent presentation, much in the form of Robert the Bruce. I am going to try and show that it is not really fraught with all kinds of ghosts and boogeymen, and with that, let me commence. The first thing I want to mention is that security is more than military security, and if we were to confine ourselves to the traditional construct where traditionally security used to be thought of only in terms of the defense of territory within a state system, whose defining characteristic was an incessant competition for military security or superiority with other nation states, all of which were lying without superior or governing authority, within a classic state of anarchy, then I'm afraid that we are antediluvian in the extreme. Today, the government of India, like many governments of the Indian Ocean Rim and its island countries, recognizes that there are a number of dimensions of security, and of these, military is one of them. It is by no means an unimportant one, but it is arguable whether it is the most important one. There are certainly political, economic, societal, and environmental dimensions that must be considered. The other thing I want to start off with as an axiom is that maritime is much more than the Navy Coast Guard amalgam. And once again, if we were to concentrate upon the bogies that lie within the military domain, and within that, as represented by navies and coast guards in amalgamation, then I'm afraid we're going to have some imaginary difficulties that don't really exist. Maritime security has been declared and enunciated at our apex prime ministerial level within India as being freedom from threats arising either in or from the seas. And these threats could be man-made, they could be natural, there could be a combination. And the reason why this maritime security is so important at a commercial level, of course, is the dependence of the Indian Ocean countries upon maritime merchandise trade. This tabulation to which I draw your attention shows you that in the case of large countries, India, for example, has a merchandise trade to GDP ratio, or its openness index, which has a decadal average of 36.3%, which is amazing. This is a huge jump from the state in 1980, and it is only because we've had 4 years of economic slowdown at the global level that this is not a higher value than it is. So if I was talking to an Indian audience, then in 1980 this wouldn't have mattered much, but today it affects the price of everything. It contributes over a third of India's GDP. So whatever happens to maritime merchandise trade impacts India very significantly. Now the same is true even more so in the case of China. As you can see, that China is standing at over 45%. Once again, I draw your attention to the fact that we have a global slowdown, which I hope is coming to an end, in which case you will start seeing these figures jump even further. Australia, you would think, is a country, being an island, a nation, an island continent, would have a very much higher trade to GDP ratio, but it's a function of the strength of the internal Australian economy that brings it down to a 30.4%, and the same is true of Japan. Right, so when this particular merchandise trade is impacted by state and non-state, and sometimes state-sponsored non-state actors, for example, the resurgence of piracy and rampant maritime crime are quite clearly manifestations of a lack of security. And this need not necessarily be dealt with by navies. However, what used to be maritime piracy emanating from maritime crime off Somalia, for example, has largely been quelled now by the cooperative actions of the globe. and global navies in particular. But there is a morphing of maritime crime and maritime piracy into maritime terrorism. Boko Haram and institutions of this nature are wreaking havoc, and I do want to mention that this transcends the entire Indian Ocean region, because as ISIS fighters, for example, return from battle-hardened experiences in Syria and end up in places like Aceh in Indonesia, where when Jakarta applies a squeeze there, they will pop like so many pips, and they will end up most probably in places like Car Nicobar in India. And so the impact of what is happening in the northwest Indian Ocean is felt all across, right down to the Southeast Asian countries, where, of course, you are more familiar with the depredations being committed there in the name of these sorts of organizations. Another security change, of course, is the security dimensions of climate change, and this does not receive the kind of attention it should. This graph or this graphic is fairly illustrative. It shows you that the most likely range is going to be between 12 and 48 inches above current sea levels. Pretty much everybody is familiar with this photograph of the Maldives, and the Maldives has a population of about 300,000 odd people, or almost 400,000 people, and if sea level rise continues at the rate it's going, we will suddenly have 400,000 boat people. And the question is, where will they go? I don't know. Do you? I think maybe they'll go to Sri Lanka. Then where will the Sri Lankans go? In short, it is not that in this room and in our representative governments we do not have enough brains to actually find solutions to this problem. The problem is that not enough people are asking the question in the first instance. If you look at India, India doesn't have the luxury of looking at Maldives with some clinical or intellectual detachment. Take a look at this tabulation by David Wheeler. In the maximum number of people of a given country affected by sea level rise is not the Maldives. It is India. It was India in 2008, and I'm afraid it will be India in 2050. So India does not, again, I repeat, have the luxury of simply looking at Maldives in some avuncular fashion and offering some intellectually stimulating solution without four fingers pointing back at New Delhi. By the end of 2018, ladies and gentlemen, we will have two Indias of equal size, as India's second tranche for the delineation of its continental shelf becomes accepted by the United Nations. And in that event, we will have a land India of 3.2 million square kilometers and a maritime India of almost exactly the same amount, 3.22 million square kilometers. So India is certainly within the Indian Ocean region going to have to struggle with the problems of achieving the right balance between maritime and land-based geopolitical imperatives. And that leads us, like every other country, to an examination of present and future risk in our region. I don't think I need to dwell upon the definitions here, so I'll just move straight on to some risk mitigation features which for us are based upon Zoltan Mertz's rather famous statement that money is a coward. Money doesn't go where there's turbulence and risk. And India's core national interest, like that of many other countries, if not all present in this room, is simply to assure the economic, material and societal well-being of the people of India. And that requires money flows. It requires the free flow of money both in and out, and the balanced flows of direct investments and all the things that people in this room are well familiar. So if there's turbulence and risk, as shown in all those blotchy areas on that particular slide, then there isn't going to be money. And because we need the money, as does everybody else, you know that famous song, Money, 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 we are driven to assure and ensure regional maritime stability. We need the region to be stable. Now, how do we do that? We can do that by simply being overbearing, like some other countries tend to do from time to time, or we can approach the whole problem in a much more cooperative and constructive manner, and that really is what we are attempting. And as our movement towards IORA and our thrust of our government towards strengthening IORA is a manifestation of our effort at constructive engagement. And I want to show you some of the features of constructive engagements and mention to you, and this is specifically in connection with the comments made by Ambassador Bhagirat in his brilliant opening statements, that we need a conceptual construct. And then you need some political direction below that. And then you need an executive construct which will actually put your money where your mouth was. And therefore, we need this across the board. So let's have a look at what's happening in the Pacific, and let me show you how it's mirrored in the Indian Ocean region. The conceptual construct, of course, ASEAN. I'm just going to show you a series of Venn diagrams. All the ambassadors and diplomats in this room are extremely familiar with this, so I'm not going to dwell upon it much. It took almost 21 years for a realization that economies cannot be progressed without safety and security, not necessarily in that order. Economic progress requires this because geopolitics itself cannot be stovepiped into its constituent groupings, and geopolitics will always be equal to geoeconomics plus the geostrategies you need for those geoeconomics plus the geostrategies you need for non-economic goals plus the interpersonal relationships between the leaderships of your nations. And therefore, WPNS, coming along 21 years after ASEAN, is a reflection of the direction in which mature economic thinking or geoeconomic thinking has moved. Of course, there are other forums that have established themselves within the Pacific region, the ARF, the ASEAN Plus 3, the six-party talks, and the East Asia Summit, to name a few. If you look at this, therefore, once again, let me show you once again. There is a conceptual structure, and it is called ASEAN. Then there's a political structure, which relates to, in this particular case, the ADMM and the ADMM plus, the constituents which are on your screen. And then you have the executive structure, which is the Western Pacific Naval Symposium, or the WPNS. So you've got a perfectly balanced grouping. Concept, political structure or a political direction, and the executive. What about in the Indian Ocean? In the Indian Ocean, there were many constructs which began immediately after the Second World War, but they were all disparate and distinct from one another, where the Arab League started off with 6 and has grown up to 23 constituents. You had the Southern African Development Council, which was important but didn't have any connection with anybody else. And then you had the WPNS, which I've just mentioned, once again, has many constituents of the Indian Ocean region, but they're also unconnected. So this is a very poor Venn diagram. Now we have the first internal incestuous sort of thing taking place with the GCC within the Arab League, and then you have IORA. One of the points I want to make right at the outset is that if IORA was to actually expand itself on this Venn diagram, if not geographically northwestwards, I think that it would be well served by the inclusion of several major powers and major influential powers that currently lie outside of its construct. This is just a recommendation, but I think it is an important one. IBSA is another construct which lies and spans more than one ocean. I won't dwell upon that, but what I do want to emphasize is this business of the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, or IONS, which was formulated in February of 2008. Look at the connectivity that it affords. Look at the groupings that are now incorporated within the Venn diagrams that I've been showing thus far. And therefore, if you look at the Indian Ocean, and you look at Sagar, or S-A-G-A-R. Sagar, of course, is a Hindi word for oceans, and it's also the mnemonic which Prime Minister Modi is very fond of. And this is how the Indian diplomatic, geoeconomic, geopolitical, really, effort is panning out in this particular stretch of ours. Right. So we've got the conceptual structure, Sagar. Then we've got IORA as the political structure, of which, of course, much has been spoken, and I need not dwell upon this any further. Then you've got the 21st century's first significant maritime security initiative, which, of course, is IONS. This is a regional forum through which the chiefs of navies of all, chiefs of navy, where the word navy doesn't really mean somebody with large guns. Comoros' Coast Guard is very much within the umbrella of the term Navy, and it doesn't have anything to do with military security. It deals with pan-regional security challenges, and this is how the in recognition of the fact that different regions, as David Brewster pointed out, have different imperatives that drive their safety and security concerns, IONS has grouped its constituent countries into the grouping shown on your screen. The chairmanship of the IONS also rotates so that it doesn't become any country-specific structure, and everybody has a chance to up and explain the criticality of their own structures for the 2 years that they've got going. Now, the IONS and IORA certainly need to have interfaces of a dynamic and proactive nature with other structures, particularly those of the EU, in terms of CRIMARIO and the IMO EU construct within the Djibouti Code of Conduct. And these information centers that exist across Sana'a and Mombasa and Mahe and Zanzibar need to expand. They need to interface. We cannot have a region which is growing stovepiped. We're just not powerful enough, not rich enough, not a resource rich enough for every country to set up its own structure. And therefore, when we talk about white shipping data sharing and the fact that India has a number of structures in place, and both formal and informal, for the sharing of white shipping, does not solve the problem. Everybody needs to be part of this. We will either hang together or we will hang separately. Similarly, we have data fusion, and data fusion replication of the startling success of the Data Fusion Center in Singapore needs to be replicated, and the Indian Navy has put forward a proposal in this regard. In fact, Pakistan is the chair for this within the IONS, and some sensible and good work is being done. So I keep putting this to you that this is the executive structure that already exists. Obviously, white shipping data needs to have more than just the exchange of data. You need to make sense out of the data, and sense-making elements are an important feature of data sharing and of maritime domain awareness. Finally, 2 or 3 points. I just wanted to end with saying that, you can't do this at some future date. You have to build your structure foundation up. And so where India is concerned, we need to be a much more in-your-face maritime nation, not just one which is spouting these comments, but one which is actually putting, as I said earlier, its money where its mouth is. And I'm very pleased that the Sagarmala project is a port-led developmental project of the current government, and it's in version 2.0, and it is doing somewhat well. So let me give you a closure by saying this is India, or I know that this is Prime Minister Narendra Modi's abbreviated initials, NAMO in Hindi, but it's really a mnemonic for me. And if you look at it, it says that we can have a north-south transport corridor. We've got the Asia-Africa growth corridor. We've got Project Mosam, which seeks to capitalize the cultural diversity and the cultural affinities of the whole Indian Ocean region, irrespective of ethnicity or faith. We've got a commitment, as the Foreign Secretary has made abundantly clear, to open seas and the freedom of navigation, and I've made mention of Project Sagar. So this formulates a bouquet, and there are 5 stems in this bouquet, and I think that together with the constructs that I mentioned, there is some possibility, some probability that we can actually get this Indian Ocean IORA to tangibly give manifestation to its intent for maritime security and safety. The International North-South Corridor has been shown on your screen. You're pretty much familiar with this. In August of 2014, in April of 2014 and August of 2017, we've done dummy runs, and we know now that we can actually go all the way from Navasheva in Mumbai to St. Petersburg in Russia. And that we will save a fairly large amount of time and money, and hopefully increase connectivity. As far as IORA is concerned, a much more important feature is the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, whose main components are well known to you. It's a very recent structure, but once again, it has great potential. Finally, I want to say that, ladies and gentlemen, contrary to the naysayers, if you have already got structures, if you will bear in mind that security is not the same as military security, if you will not forget that maritime is much more than the Navy Coast Guard amalgam, then I suggest that we already have a mirrored structure of the very successful one prevailing in the Pacific Ocean, in that IONS offers the keys of freedom from the many challenges that face us in the maritime domain, ranging from maritime crime to piracy to illegal immigration to an area of particular concern to countries like Australia, to the ingress of illegal arms, ammunition, drugs, human cargo, and such like, of which, of course, there is very little need to preach to a converted audience such as this one. And with that, I've come to the end of my presentation. I'll be happy to take on questions as you deem appropriate. Thank you.